And he says, Bill, he says, what I want you to do is to blow the whistle on this rotten, corrupt government. He says, why don't you say something outrageous like we never went to the moon?
Here I will critique yet another video challenging the authenticity of the Apollo program. The issues raised in this video are common among moon hoax conspiracy theorists. To give these issues adequate attention will take 3 videos, of which this is the first. If you believe the Apollo missions were faked, and if your ego and your need to sound like a know-it-all are more important to you than the facts, then you'd better turn this off right now. Yes, the mass media, and especially the internet, have provided us with vast amounts of instant information at our fingertips. It has also provided us with vast amounts of misinformation. Since internet users, authors of books, and documentary makers can say essentially anything they want, the public has to develop more of a show-me attitude and the ability to spot bunk, or join the, as you put it, growing army of people who really believe that the Apollo moon landings were faked. Apparently, this army doesn't have any academic or intellectual requirements for enlistment. Brian here has done an excellent job of recruiting for this army. He has raised illegitimate questions and doubts and made incorrect and ill-informed claims. Just today, this video hit 50,000 views. If it has influenced only 2% of its viewers, then Brian has contributed 1,000 misinformed people to the population, and they, in turn, will spread that misinformation to others. That's a whole battalion of new hoax believers, so this makes Brian a major or lieutenant colonel in the war against reason and truth. It's like a disease, an epidemic, only in this case the carriers seem committed to infecting other people. For them, it's a source of pride and expression of grand conceit. Like Typhoid Mary, they do it out of ignorance, refusal to listen to reason, and indifference to the consequences for others. So let's deal with some of Brian's issues. First, he asks, was it really possible? Did they have the technology in 1492 to sail 3 little ships across the Atlantic Ocean? Well, barely. It was a high-risk mission and the odds were against them, but they did it. Consider the audacity of South African surgeon Christian Barnard in his attempt to transplant a human heart, but in 1967, he did it. And what about Picard and Walsh, who in 1960 took the Trieste to an ocean depth of 36,000 feet, where the pressure on their hull was 7 tons per square inch? They did it, despite the risks. Brian claims the lunar module's thrust rockets are said to have blown away the dust. This being the case, how was it that astronauts were able to make footprints in this dry and now dustless from the rocket environment? Simple. Your premise is wrong. Sure, the thruster blew away a lot of dust, but since the thruster was not a very powerful engine and it was widely spread, the amount of dust removed wasn't all that great. And the astronauts didn't walk underneath the LEM where most of the dust blowing would have occurred. The areas around the LEM were relatively undisturbed. I'd like to see one of these hoax believers demonstrate some calculations that show how much dust should have been blown away. But I don't think we'll see that. As one YouTuber said, bringing up math with a conspiracy theorist is like flashing a vampire with a crucifix. You just make unwarranted assertions to support your hoax theory. You parrot what other misinformed hoaxers say, and you don't have a shred of data to defend it. next issue is that the astronaut's footprints should not have been so deep. Well, I would have to ask you, how do you know this? What calculations have you done? Personally, I don't think you have any idea what you're talking about. Once again, you're just making blind assertions without one shred of evidence to back them up. In most places on the moon, the regolith is at least a couple inches deep. It's also made up of an extremely fine material, which is uneroded grains, which tend to stick together better. And don't forget that on the moon, where there's only 1/6 of the gravity of the Earth, forms like this are going to be much more stable, and sharp edges much less likely to collapse. There are many videos showing astronauts walking around the moon, making deep, sharply contoured prints like this with their boots, and kicking dust around, proving that it's anything but wet. Your next issue is easy to understand and just as easy to debunk. I've dealt with it in a previous video myself, but I suppose one more time won't hurt. Every time a hoaxer comes up with this argument and it's debunked, 5 more will pop up in his place, probably because they just saw it in a YouTube video like yours here, Brian, and now they consider themselves experts, purely on the conceit that if they don't know the answer, then the whole thing must have been faked. Well, I know the answer, and so will anybody else who watches this. But Brian, what about those thousands of people who've already seen your video and that you have so badly misled? Are you going to catch up with all of them and say, "Oh, I'm sorry, I was wrong"? And you weren't just wrong. You have insulted a great many people in the process. I'll use my own copies of these pictures because they're a better quality. If this was fake, it would mean that NASA's teams of photo experts, aerospace engineers, and astrophysicists, some of the most brilliant rocket scientists in the world, collectively made the mistake of taking these 2 pictures on their fake moon set and then allowed them to go public. To make such an assumption is the height of audacity and stupidity. Let's see what it was that hoax advocates couldn't figure out. First of all, does anyone notice a huge difference in the foreground? Do you really suppose the set designers moved the lem off and then dug a hole and filled it with rocks just so hoax nuts would have something to gripe about? What throws people off here is the background. Since there is no air on the moon, distant objects will appear just as clear as nearby ones. And with no familiar ground references, it's very difficult to judge distance and size on the moon. These are the Apennine Mountains. They are 6 to 10 miles away from the Apollo 15 landing site. These 2 pictures were taken in the same direction, but one could be taken from 50 to 100 meters to the left or right of the other without showing any appreciable change in background. There are many examples in the NASA archives which show this effect. I've chosen this one to further illustrate the point. Notice in these next 13 pictures taken from the lunar rover on Apollo 17 how very different the foregrounds look, but these distant features hardly change at all. There are literally hundreds more just from this mission. Do you suppose NASA built a different huge foreground for every one? This is South Massif in the distance. It's a mountain and it's miles away.
Outrageous.